All right, man. Here we go. Let's fucking go, man. Let's go. Let's get this shit. Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is my preview and prediction for the monster, David Benavidez versus Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. Let's get this shit, man. This is gonna be a man, bro. I've been excited for this fight since this fight's been made, and it just wow. It is fight week. Time is going by so quickly, and stuff like that. Of the fight getting here, and it just this week is going by so quickly and stuff. All of this week, I've been posting videos of fights, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, man, and shit like that. And now we're here. We still got a few more after this video, but here we go, man. The major one, David the Monster. David Benavidez versus Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. Let's get it, man. And yeah, man, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Two prize fighters. And what I was saying before this fight and shit, before I was doing this prediction and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Is this gotta be probably the most expensive cruiserweight fight of all time, bro? Because I'm just saying, because either way, I mean, because fights are expensive, but I'm just saying, because with these two fighters, for one, it's pay-per-view. That's probably that's the main thing, because it's pay-per-view. And for two and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Because both of these fighters are big name fighters, very big name fighters, and they're fighting each other. You know what I mean? So that adds to that. And then the viewership for this fight, yeah. I feel like this fight overall for this weight class is gonna break records, in my opinion, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, man, and stuff like that. Really good fight, damn good fight. And shit like that. Let's see how David Benavidez's power is gonna be against Zurdo Ramirez, and stuff like that. Somebody who's dominating the cruiserweight division, and stuff like that. He does have that loss, he does have that one defeat and stuff like that. You know what I mean, right? That one defeat. But yeah, so Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez comes into this fight with the record of 48 wins, 30 wins coming by way of knockout, with only suffering one defeat. And that only defeat was to the one and only great, not one and only great, but to the great Dimitri Bivol. And yeah, and I remember that fight and shit. He still showed up. He still showed up in the fight. He still brought a pretty tough fight and stuff like that. But obviously with Dimitri Bivol, he was the one who beat Archer Beterbiev in the second fight. So obviously we know of how fucking good Dimitri Bivol is. And with that win against Canelo Alvarez, and shit like that, so I'm just saying, so either way, Gilberto Ramirez has a lot of game. He has a lot of talent, and shit like that. He actually is a very tricky fighter, and shit like that. A very consistent fighter. And regardless of any fight, he still is gonna bring a really tough fight, and he still is can win against any fight, and he could still win against David Benavidez. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. He has the size advantage over David Benavidez. I believe he has the reach advantage over David Benavidez. Not by a whole lot, so it's not really going to matter much, but he could still go and use that against David Benavidez. But yeah, but that one defeat was only to the great Dimitri Bivol, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But, overall bounced back with a unanimous decision win against Joe Smith Jr. I believe I watched that fight. Was that their second fight or was that their first fight? That was their first fight. And then he had that win against Arsen Golamirian, and stuff like that. Which back in the day, until he became inactive and shit like that, this dude was actually a pretty hot prospect, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Until he got beat by Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez, and then he beat Chris Billum Smith, which that's a damn good win, and shit like that, because Chris Billum Smith is a big name and he's a big time fighter over in his country of Great Britain, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, and he also got belts and shit like that, but I think he took his belts, Gilberto Ramirez, you know what I mean? And then he had that win against Uniel Dorticos, which he did show some really, really high ring IQ, which to box that well against a boxer that can box that well of Uniel Dorticos, that showed a lot of ring IQ with Gilberto Ramirez, where he won't just beat your ass and will just smother you up. He'll also utilize good range. He'll utilize a good jab, and shit like that, bounce around the ring and shit like that. Use beautiful lateral movement, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, man, and stuff like that, David Benavidez comes into this fight with the perfect record of 31 wins, 25 wins coming by way of knockout with no losses. And overall, he came off of a really good win against Anthony Yarde, beat the crap out of Anthony Yarde. But either way, you got to give respect to Anthony Yarde. He still showed some toughness. He still showed levels of high fighting skill, and that overall that he can fight. Does he have a fight coming up, Anthony Yarde? No, he doesn't, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But overall, he still showed that he can still fight. He still showed that he definitely has a very high ring IQ. Can box extremely well, can box very well off the jab, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Has definitely a good sharpshooting style, Anthony Yarde, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And, David Benavidez dealt with Anthony Yarde very well. And then with that win against David Morrell, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Hold on, let me get this ad out of here. And sorry about that, YouTube and all of my people that's watching this video. Love y'all. But with that win against David Morrell, honestly, I feel like that fight till this day, out of all of the fighters that David Benavidez has fought in, and shit like that. And I'll probably, add more to this. I feel like David Morrell was David Benavidez's toughest fight, in my opinion, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Because overall and stuff like that, even though Benavidez and shit like, but honestly, if you really would have kind of looked at that fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? That fight honestly could have been extremely close if you could have looked at it, and shit like that. But the body work and overall of the workload of David Benavidez, I mean, he did beat David Morrell in that fight, but Morrell put up a really damn tough test. But then there's also Caleb Plant. But Caleb Plant was only good for a good 5 rounds, and then after that, he just got outworked by David Benavidez. Lucky he didn't get stopped by David Benavidez in that fight, and shit like that, But he did good, though, really good in those first 5 rounds, though. But same thing for Demetrius Andrade, and same thing for Alexander Vosdik, and it's kind of the same thing with David Lemieux, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And Kyron Davis and Ronald Ellis, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, and Anthony Durrell, a lot of his fights and shit like that, he allowed where fighters would get to him and shit, but then overall he would get to work on them and shit like that, and that was the same thing when he fought David Morrell, but it was a little bit more kind of tougher, more of like a rugged, more ruggeder, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And it was just more harder for him, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? That's the thing and shit, So both of these fighters have some pretty damn good wins and shit like that, you know what I mean? And they both have outstanding outstanding records, and shit like that. You know what I mean? One only suffering one defeat, one is undefeated. But Zurdo's that one defeat, it didn't change him at all. He still showed very good toughness, and after that, he still showed obvious elite consistencies of him winning and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, it's just, is he gonna allow David Benavidez to do him like that though? You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. Is he gonna allow Benavidez to do him like that? To walk up in the cruiserweight division and to beat him? Even though Dimitri Bivol did that, but Bivol's a natural, like he could go up to the cruiserweight division, Bivol, you know what I mean? But overall, naturally, Bivol is more of a bigger fighter than Benavidez, but naturally, Benavidez, he sized it up pretty well in the cruiserweight division, but he's more kind of skinnier, more thinner, and shit like that, and that's what I'm saying, and this is an elite fighter and shit like that, But either way and shit like that, you know what I mean? I feel like the size shouldn't matter and shit like that when it comes down to it. So either way, the technique for David is still going to be the same and shit like that, you know what I mean? But it's still going to be the same for Zurdo. And how are those shots going to impact on Benavidez and shit like that, you know what I mean? With the power difference of Zurdo. Because Zurdo is naturally the more bigger fighter than Benavidez and shit like that. But let's see of how much realistically and shit like that, you know what I mean? Because realistically, Benavidez at 168, he was considered a big 168 pounder, and that's the thing and shit. But once he went up to 175, he was kind of a little bit more smaller, and now that he's at cruiserweight, that's the thing. And this is gonna be his first fight at cruiserweight, and that's the thing. So I wonder of the weight difference. I wonder of how it's gonna be and shit like that. Because I mean, he sized up on Anthony Yard well and shit like that, but he still looked more smaller than Anthony Yard at the same time and shit like that. You know what I mean? But he still got rid of Anthony Yard, so that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But Zurdo and shit like that is staying consistent, beat that undefeated fighter of Arsene Garlulion, and shit like that, you know what I mean? I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but he beat that dude and shit like that, who was undefeated 27-0, and gave him his first loss, and beat Uniel Dorticos, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And a few other fighters and stuff like that Zurdo beat. And with that win against Uniel Dorticos, especially with that win against Dorticos, which he's going against a fighter that's good at being technically sound, and shit like that, you know what I mean? He fought very well against that fighter and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, and hold on, guys. And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And overall, like, he fought very well against that guy and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, but overall, that's the thing and shit, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Because Dorticos is a tough fighter, man. And I would like to see Dorticos fight some tough fighters too, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, And Zurdo looked good in that fight. Even though Dorticos, he did win rounds in that fight. In the early rounds, Dorticos was bagging in those early rounds. But the way of how Zurdo did switch up the game plan very well, and overall and stuff like that, he did switch up the game plan very well and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And and he used a good jab, lateral movement, obviously consistent punching with power, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And and he did really good in that fight, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, And obviously with David Benavidez, in every single fight that he's been in, from Morel, from Demetrius Andrade, from Anthony Yard, from Alexander Vosdick, from David Lemieux, from all of the fights that he's been in and shit like that, David Benavidez, he's looked elite in those fights. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. Absolutely looked elite in those fights and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? And again and stuff like that. You know what I mean? In the Morrell fight. But yeah, in that fight with David Morrell and stuff like that, you know what I mean? He looked pretty good in that fight against David Morrell. Hit the body very well against David Morrell, and stuff like that, pressured David Morrell, made David Morrell like overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? He was the aggressor. He threw the more punches. But overall in that fight against David Morrell, that still was his toughest fight to till this date, and shit like that. You never know. Zurdo could be his toughest fight, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, because Zurdo's a really, really good fighter and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. An outstanding fighter Zurdo is. A really, really good fighter Zurdo is. And shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But overall, in size, the one thing with Zurdo is that even with Zurdo's, he's also kind of a smaller cruiserweight. You know what I mean? So in this type of fight, I feel like, even though Zurdo's still going to be the more bigger fighter, but I feel like naturally speaking, I feel like Benavidez is the more bigger fighter, but we'll see of how it plays out. You know what I mean? Because Benavidez still was more smaller than Alexander Vosdick. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. He was still smaller and shit like that, than Alexander Vosdick, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Hold on, guys. I have to make sure that. But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And basically and shit, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff, hold on, I think there was like a B or some shit, and stuff like that. So I was like, oh shit, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and stuff like that, with Benavidez, and shit like that, he did his fucking thing, bro, against all of these niggas, bro. So I'm just saying. So this is gonna be a good fight, man. We already know about Benavidez's resume. And when he beat on Demetrius Andrade and shit like that, you know what I mean? That was an ass beatdown, bro. And honestly, till this day, I feel like that was one of his wins that really made me think to myself of how fucking truly good David Benavidez is, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, because the way of how because even though he did get outboxed early in the rounds within the first 3 rounds, but then after that, the next 3 rounds, like, shit, I think, like, Andre got stopped in, like, the 6th or 8th round it was, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So just once Benavidez let his hands go, bro, Andre couldn't handle none of that, bro. And Andre is still a tough fighter, bro. It's just his tricky, lengthy orthodox style, and shit like that, is a very good tool to use in boxing, and he uses it very well. And he's and stuff like that. He's a very he's a very unorthodox fighter, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like, even though he's orthodox, but what I mean by unorthodox is just he stances himself very weird, where he's like and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, because then he comes in with the power hand first, power hand always, and it just overall, when you have a lengthy orthodox style, and the person who has also a lengthy orthodox style is Sebastian Fundora, you know what I mean? Andrade and Fundora, with those styles of their lengthy orthodox type of style, they are really effective. They know, like, every single punch they land is with power, because whenever they stand like that, they're whenever you're like, especially But more when you're an orthodox fighter, your lead hand is your power hand, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. Regularly, like when you're orthodox, like even though you can mix it up to make it the other way and shit like that. You know what I mean? Like Andy Ruiz and shit like that. He does it like this. But I think Andy Ruiz, like, he sometimes, no, yeah, he's an orthodox fighter, and shit like that, I believe, and stuff like that. But then he'll switch to land the left hand strong and quick, and shit like that in an awkward way, too. It just comes in with a quick fucking hook out of nowhere and just hurt you bad, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. But the one with lengthy orthodox styles of what I'm saying is Sebastian Fundora and Demetrius Andrade. And they both always carry so much power, and it just, even when they tap with their punches, they always come in with a lot of power, and shit like that, and that's the thing. Benavidez went through that shit, and shit like that. And I think Benavidez himself, no, he's a southpaw, and shit like that. Like he's a southpaw, but Benavidez has also kind of like a rugged, shifty style for himself too, because he has kind of a flat-footed, come forward type of stance. You know what I mean? But overall, he's bouncy with his feet when he needs to, and shit like that, And then like he uses his footwork well when he needs to, and he gets out of danger when he needs to very well, and shit like that. And he can make anybody miss with punches and counter them with combinations and smother them to the ropes and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And that's what Benavidez does really, really well and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Excuse me. And he does that very, very well. And stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. So. And he beat Andre, bro. He beat Andre. With that kind of shifty style, he beat Andre. Until this day, I want to see Andre be more active. I mean, I haven't seen him fight in fucking, like, that was ever since he lost to David Benavidez. Like, it's just, I haven't really seen him fight, but I still think he can fight. He might be a little bit up in age. He's probably like 36, 37, Andrade is and shit like that, you know what I mean? But he's still got probably the quick hands and footwork and everything. Like, he's still a damn good high quality fighter. He just lost to a damn good fighter of David Benavidez. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. He could have a chance to win against any type of fighter, and shit like that. And that was only the first fight against Benavidez, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. So I believe in Demetrius Andrade, but I'm just saying Benavidez beat Demetrius Andrade. Benavidez beat David Morrell. Benavidez beat Alexander Gvozdyk, who is in the come up of starting to become a good fighter. And I think he was the one who officially retired Gvozdyk again, and shit like that, because Gvozdyk was already retired, but then I believe he retired again. But yeah, Benavidez actually didn't retire Gvozdyk, but Gvozdyk recently got knocked out by Kalajdzic, and stuff like that. The one dude that David Morrell fought. I forgot how do you pronounce his first name. Wait, hold up. Let's see if it's recording. But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But, overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, you know what I mean? Kalajdzic, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? He's honestly a pretty underrated fighter, in my opinion. But basically what I'm saying is that Benavidez and shit like that, he's a good fighter. Obviously, really an elite fighter. Beat all of these great fighters. David Morrell, Demetrius Andrade, you know what I mean? And, and he's beaten, but yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and stuff like that, this is going to be a really good fight. And overall and stuff like that, you know what I mean? With David Benavidez's wins and stuff like that, let me try to get this out of here, okay? But then he got to win against Demetrius Andrade. Caleb Plant when he was in his prime. David Lemieux, he beat. But that was more of an older David Lemieux, but David Lemieux still kind of proved that he kind of was still able to fight, though. And shit like that, because he caught David Benavidez with a few shots, but it just more of kind of was his chin, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, but as you can see, though, David Lemieux has got knocked out, several times in his career, out of his 5 losses, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, and stuff like that, but overall and stuff, David Lemieux, David Morrell, and then Anthony Yard, and shit like that, Kyron Davis, and Kyron Davis isn't too bad of a fighter, and oh shit. Oh no, you just put it on the porch? Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, and stuff like that. And then Anthony Durrell too. Anthony Durrell, he also defeated Anthony Durrell and stuff like that, you know what I mean? When Anthony Durrell was also in his prime, and stuff like that. And he actually knocked out Anthony Durrell, you know what I mean? And yeah, you too. And he knocked out Anthony Durrell in that fight, and stuff like that, And Anthony Durrell during that time, before that fight, I forgot who his only loss was to. If I'm not mistaken, I think he drew Badu Jack. That's what it was. I knew it was Badu Jack. It was Badu Jack by majority decision. That was his loss back in the day, was to Badu Jack. And then after that, then he lost to David Benavidez Benavidez. And overall, that's when he eventually, hold on, let me get this out of here. So I'm so sorry about this, guys. And then overall and stuff like that, then you got him, Anthony Durrell. Then he got absolutely knocked the fuck out by Caleb Plant, and even though it was not too bad of it wasn't too bad of a fight. I mean, that fight was kind of a war, to be honest with you, and shit like that. But Caleb Plant was still kind of ahead, but it was back and forth before Caleb Plant knocked him out and shit like that. But Caleb Plant was mainly ahead during the fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So he was still winning, but then he knocked out Durrell. But Durrell during the time when in 2019 when he fought against David Benavidez, and I believe that was on the main card of the Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia fight, I believe it was, I think it was that, I believe, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But, overall and stuff like that, Benavidez has great wins. And yeah. But on to, what these fighters are really good at. And yeah. And yeah, man, it's shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, it's shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit, but what these fighters are really good at, and we're gonna go back to David Benavidez. What Benavidez is really good at is utilizing really excruciating pressure. He utilizes his size with the pressure. He has very athletic punching, very athletic boxing skill with his size, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? He almost kind of has like a sharpshooting style with his own type of aggressional style and stuff like that. Knows how to avoid punches, knows how to stance himself well and shit like that, while he can land his devastating punches and shit like that, you know what I mean? And overall and stuff like that, he could punch any type of way and he could really just put all types of damage on you, and shit like that, regardless of anything, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, so overall and shit like that, that's the thing and shit like that, with David Benavidez, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And he's just a really good fighter, and shit like that, has a great chin, great stamina, and shit like that, has a big frame, power, and stuff like that, quick with those hands, it just, with 6 combinations, you can't see any punches being thrown. Sometimes you can only count 3 of them when it could be 6 to 10 combinations into the punch, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Body, head, body, head, head, body. all head, all body, it doesn't matter, bro, and shit like that. It's just he'll put damage into you. He could be able to put the power. He could be able to put the power onto you and shit like that. You know what I mean? To be able to really, to be able to really hurt you with single punches, and shit like that. Like overall, I feel like in boxing, I feel like David Benavidez probably could be ranked number one at having the best punch selection, the best creativity with his punches, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And just overall, when it comes down to fast combinations mixed with power, I just like when it mainly comes with that, I feel like Benavidez is like the best when it comes down to that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So overall, that's the thing and shit like that with David Benavidez. Great fighter, and shit like that. Humble human being, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Has a lot of game, has a lot of confidence. For a Mexican fighter, I mean, he has a lot of cockiness, and shit like that. Mexican fighters are definitely known to being very like cordial and shit, but Benavidez has that sway in him, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Because he trains in the West Coast. I think he from California, I believe. But yeah, and shit like that. But basically, he's from Phoenix, Arizona, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And the motherfuckers from Phoenix and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, you know what I mean? That's the thing and shit like that. They know how to squabble, and shit like that. They definitely know, like, and not just that, but it's just overall, that's a part of the West. That's part of the West. That, I mean, like, that's the Midwest. But either way and shit like that, and shit like that, you know what I mean? It's just Benavidez is a different type of breed, bro, and shit like that with his personality. Like, he almost has like a black personality, like a black dude's personality and shit like that, mixed with like, being Mexican and shit like that, because it's just very confident, has a lot of game, and shit like that. But if you respect him, he's gonna respect you. I feel like between Benavidez and Zurdo's, there's been always pretty much mutual respect with each other and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, But Benavidez is just a creative fighter, can fight sharpshootingly. He could, like, with an aggressive style. He could be fight with aggressive style. He just got quick hands, accurate hands, very high punch IQ, very high ring IQ, very high IQ of really anything and shit like that, And it's just really with anything with his type of kind of like funky style and his like kind of like kind of like his like more of like rugged type of stance and shit like that, he boxes really well, and shit like that, he'll take punches too and shit like that, you know what I mean? And he'll show that he has a great chin, but then he just shows to other fighters that overall with his punching and shit like that, he just is the better fighter than a lot of these other fighters and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, but that's the thing about David Benavidez. That's really good. What's really good about Zurdo Ramirez and shit like that, is again with Zurdo, he could box really good off the jab. He could be able to utilize the ring very well. He also has quick hands, and shit like that. But then most importantly, he has heavy hands, and shit like that. He does put a lot of damage on his fighters and shit like that. But then he doesn't waste any time into throwing his punches to landing his punches, and kind of like with Benavidez, he makes sure that he lands his punches. And he lands his punches clean. He makes sure that he shows you of who's boss, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And overall and shit like that, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, you know what I mean? And overall and shit like that, he kind of does the same thing where he kind of shows of who's boss, and shit like that, you know what I mean? With this punching and shit like that, and shows people of how truly good he is, how good Zurdo is, what he can bring to the table and shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, man, and shit like that. And Benavidez doesn't want to just go and get caught by Zurdo like that, and shit like that, because Zurdo and the cruiserweight division is his division, so he's gonna know how to hit, he is gonna know how to punch and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. He's proved that in so many fights. And he's proved that he also got very, very high ring IQ himself and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, But it's And overall, Zurdo, even though he'll shell up, but Zurdo isn't a fighter where he'll just go and shell up. Even if he's taking a punches, it's not like he's gonna be a fighter to really shell up like that, and shit like that. And he'll still take the punch and he'll still throw his punches too, and shit like that at the same time and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit, and stuff like that. And he does a lot of damage, moves the feet around, can block punches, can swing the fight back to dictating the fight into his own type of fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And that's what's really good about Zurdo Ramirez, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, man, and shit like that, overall, again, really good fighter and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And and yeah, and both of these fighters move their feet around the ring, and both these fighters have good technique, and both these fighters are going to be throwing a lot of punches and going to be throwing with a lot of power. And I feel like Zurdo has a lot of similarities with Benavidez, especially like from like back in the day, because Zurdo, like, he's technically has been at the bigger level longer than Benavidez, even though Benavidez has had more better fights than Zurdo, but Zurdo has been at the higher level, has been pronounced as being at the higher level longer than Benavidez, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So it's almost like Benavidez is kind of fighting like, a back in the day of himself, almost kind of like, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Because Zurdo has, again, a lot of technique, fights off the jab, can throw a lot of quick punches, hooks, crosses, jabs, switch jabs, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Body, head punches, just a bunch of big, heavy flurries, and shit, and he can dictate a fight against any type of fighter, and that's what Zurdo can do very well, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But what these fighters got to do into winning this fight. But next is what these fighters need to do into winning this fight. And what these fighters need to do into winning this fight and stuff like that, And what we're gonna start off with is Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. What Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez needs to do into winning this fight and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Is that Gilberto gotta be able to I feel like he gotta be able to show Benavidez that he got the same amount of experience as you do when it comes down to fighting good fighters. They have fought in different weight classes basically their whole time of their extreme success and shit like that, you know what I mean? So overall and shit like that, in that kind of case of scenario and stuff like that, you know what I mean, with Zurdo and stuff like that, that's the thing. So he needs to utilize that, not go into this fight acting like a fool and trying to give so much respect to Benavidez. Because this is an important fight, man. You need to show and stuff like that, Benavidez, that you're not going to just go into this fight and you're just going to go and lose. You're going to go into this fight and wanting to fight tough, and that you have a good chin. You could take punches. I've never really seen you get buckled or hurt like that from punches like that, you know what I mean? And you fought in some good fighters with some good punching, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So overall and shit like that, like maybe there's been a few fights. I mean, everybody gets hurt every once in a while and shit like that, you know what I mean? But I've seen plenty of Zurdo fights, and I have never seen where Zurdo has gotten I've seen where Benavidez got dropped and shit like that by Ronald Gavril back in the day and shit like that, you know what I mean? Still stop Gavril and shit like that, you know what I mean? But he got dropped by Ronald Gavril, and shit like that, so you need to know that, take advantage of that, and know of how fucking good of a fighter you are. Know of how many great fighters that Benavidez has beaten and stuff like that, and show him who's boss. Because I feel like you got the technique, you got everything of what it is to be able to beat David Benavidez, and shit like that, and maybe you have something that. But overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like Zurdo, maybe you have something that maybe other fighters don't. Because the one thing with David Benavidez is I feel like this is the first like Mexican, like true Mexican war that Benavidez is gonna be facing. And this is a really fucking talented, tough fighter. I promise you, this is a really talented, tough fighter, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? That can really give a lot of problems to David Benavidez. Like stylistically, with what I'm saying. All you got to do is be in that right mentality, bro. All you got to do is be in that right mentality, to be able to win, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. You got to be in that right mentality, and shit like that. You know what I mean? You got to be able to know that you can do this. You got to be able to know that you got the more experience, that you got, that overall you got the more fights, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Overall, you also got the experience too. You got the skills. You got everything. You got the skills to pay the bills. You got the footwork, the jab, everything and shit like that. But the one thing is that you got to be able to stick with that mentality. You got to match the mentality with Benavidez. And when you match that mentality, you got to be able to be more than him with that mentality and stuff like that after. You got to be able to throw the more punches. You got to be able to throw the more effective punches. You got to show Benavidez that you are the man in this fight, and shit like that. You're going to get countered. You're going to get hit. But you need to be able to hit and counter Benavidez with some really good shots. And you got to be able to really, like catch him and shit like that, because because the one thing that you do have is where if Benavidez stays too close to it, too open and shit like that, where he will leave his hands low when he'll punch and shit like that. And if you could be able to sneak that punch in before you could be able to reach, and shit like that, to catch the punch and shit like that, you know what I mean? You could be able to hit him and counter him with a really good punch and shit like that, damn near drop him, buckle him, and shit like that, and do that every single time. And it just, and it doesn't matter of how he comes at you. It just, you could be able to land that punch every single time and hurt Benavidez, and shit like that. You know what I mean? One thing is the left and the right hook, but I love that. But overall, and shit like that. Like that right hook is beautiful, but I feel like that come up hook, with that left hook after he throws his combinations, like that shit is very devastating when he lands that, and shit like that. Whenever he ends with his combinations, he always ends with a really powerful punch. It's like he calculates how much he's hitting you, how much power that is, and then after that, that's where he ends with the devastating punch. Because every punch is devastating, but then he makes sure that last shot is extremely devastating and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit. So overall, it just, you gotta have that right mentality, Zurdo. And shit like that. Don't allow the statistics to get to you. Overall, stylistically, this should be more of an easier fight for you to hit somebody more than the fight where you fought against Dimitri Bivol. And you hit Bivol too. You were able to catch him on counters and flurries. It just, you weren't able to match up with his skills and overall the punch stats or anything. But it just, overall, that's the thing and shit. But at the same time, this is going to be more of an easier fight where you could be able to actually land the punches on Benavidez. You know what I mean? And shit like that. You could actually land the counters, land anything you want on Benavidez, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And you could just toy with Benavidez. Like, And that's the thing, and he could literally toy with Benavidez and shit. So I was like, looking at the time and shit like that, making sure everything's good and shit like that, and everything's good and shit. But and yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean. And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean, and stuff like that, you know what I mean. But overall, that's the thing and stuff, so yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean. And that's the thing and shit, so yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean. But overall, that's what Zurdo got to be able to do in this fight. Right mentality. Obviously, fight with your elite skill set. I'm pretty damn sure he is going to. Zurdo is not going to go into this fight slouch down. I watched plenty of both of these niggas' fights. Zurdo ain't going to go and slouch down like that against nobody. You know, unless if you have the right, like, you know, like footwork. And because the one thing that will always dominate any type of fight is footwork. And Benavidez does got footwork. But what kind of footwork? Because Zurdo also got footwork. You know, we know that Benavidez can just casually run into punches, you know, and shit like that. Straight punches sometimes too. Straight down the pipe, you know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But he knows how to adapt, change it up, and shit like that, you know, and land with counters and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's what he does very, very well and shit like that, you know what I mean? And then flurries and everything. But when he's going against Zurdo, who's gonna, no matter what, stay in that fight and shit like that, you know, with his counters, with his punching, that's the thing. If Zurdo does do that, and especially if he stays again in that right mentality in this fight, he can do that. Because again, he got a good jab, he got quick hands, he got power, you know, he got good body head punching, you know, and shit like that. Good fluent punch technique, you know, and shit like that. In and out boxing skill, you know, and shit like that. No diddy. But I'm just saying, like, at the same time and shit like that, you know, all respect it to all, like, you know, like the LGBTQ, you know, respect y'all, you know, and stuff, love y'all and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, you know, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. So it's just at the same time and shit, you know, and stuff like that, you know, that's what Zurdo got to do into winning this fight, man. Fight how you fight. But the one thing that he does need to do is try to fight from the outside. You got the reach. You can use the jab. Squirrel yourself in the inside. Land your punches. Direct yourself in there. Because overall, you got the power. You can fucking bam and sit Benavidez right on his ass. So at the same time, you could just go jab, jab, jab. Get in the inside. Bam, bam, bam. Land your punches. Dictate the fight. But you got to stick to quickly dictating the fight where you can continuously make Benavidez guess. Curl him up and shell him up. You know, and shit like that. You got to continuously make him guess. But that jab is going to continuously make him guess in this fight. That jab is going to, no matter what, continuously make him guess in this fight. You know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And if you could send that right hand down the pipe, which I do see you be doing that too, where you can send that right hand down the pipe, do so. You know, because you got a beautiful southpaw style. You just got to send that punch down the pipe. You know, you got to send that right hand down the pipe. You know, you got to be quick with that right hand. You know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit, you know. So, and yeah, you know, and stuff like that. Because, again, Benavidez got dropped before. He tasted the canvas before a long time ago. But I'm just saying and shit like that, you know. But it just, Mexican versus Mexican, Zurdo ain't gonna be wasting no time to throwing his punches. He better not waste no fucking time into throwing his punches, because I'm gonna be very disappointed if he does. Because as Zurdo, he's a high level fighter. I know of how high of a level of a fighter Benavidez is, but Zurdo is a high level fighter too. You cannot let Benavidez roll you up like that and shit like that, you know, and make you lose like that, you know, and shit like that. You got it. So that's why I have very close eyes on this fight, man. Because literally, you got to be able to fight well. You got to be able to fight elite. You got to be able to know what you got to do and shit like that. You know what I mean? And you can't let Benavidez just hammer you down like that and curl you up to shell you up. Because then when you shell up like that, Benavidez could just now... You're just a walking punching bag now and shit like that. You know what I mean? And now Benavidez can just hit you on the arms, hit you on the head, you know, open up your guard, hit you to the body and shit like that. You know what I mean? He could do whatever the fuck that he wants to do at that point and shit like that, you know, if you just curl up. So that's why you got to distance yourself quickly and shit like that, you know, manage the fight quickly and shit like that. You know what I mean? And then quickly get to that jab, get to the body. And you got to be in the right mentality. Don't take so many punches. You know, also move to the outside too. You know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Use your creative footwork to get around and shit like that. To get your punches in. You know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that what Zurdo Ramirez got to be able to do. And again, most important thing, use that jab. Zurdo got a good jab. He got a good, stiff, lengthy, good jab. So you got to be able to pop that shit out. Length that shit out, you know, pop it out, you know, and stuff like that, you know, with the jab and shit like that, you know what I mean? catch him on the nose, catch him down the pipe, and shit like that. Move your feet around the ring, and shit like that. You gotta be the person in this fight to slow the pace down, on Benavidez. You can't always keep this pace just consistently going and shit like that against Benavidez. You got to be able to keep that pace going and shit like that. You got to be able to slow down that pace. Get that jab going. Move away from the counters. Block the counters. And shit like that. You know what I mean? But no matter what, Benavidez is going to go and counter you. So at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? You got to know how to throw and land those punches flush to know that's going to be that. That's going to be a good punch singly and shit like that, So if Benavidez just hits you on the arm or whatever, that's not going to really count for anything. Because overall and shit like that, you hit him clean with the nice punch. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. And you got to do that consistently with the jab. You got to throw a nice, stiff, really good, powerful jab. Not just to launch that shit. Quick, sniper jab. But you got to be able to, with that sniper jab that you're snapping, got to have power. Got to have a good amount of power. It got to hurt Benavidez. He got to feel that shit, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? You got to time him and then bam, catch him with a nice right hand to send him on the canvas, and shit like that. You know what I mean? It's all about good punch technique and shit like that. If you have really, really good punch technique, you can absolutely win this fight, man. And you got a good chance, bro. You have just as much of a chance as Benavidez into winning this fight, Zurdo. And that's the thing. But officially, that's what Zurdo Ramirez got to do into winning this fight. All right, next up, we got David Benavidez of what he got to do into winning this fight. Overall, just smother him, man. You already know that you got quick footwork. You really got the advantage with everything. But the one thing, don't let Zurdo get any breathing room. Because the one thing I do know damn well that Zurdo is going to want to do in this fight is that he's going to want to get some breathing room away from David Benavidez and shit like that, He's not, like, I don't know if he's going to calculate everything very well with Zurdo and shit when he's breathing his way out, when he's trying to get some breathing room against Benavidez, like knowing how to throw a good jab or, I'm pretty sure he will and shit like that, you know what I mean? But it's just at the same time and shit like that, Benavidez and shit like that, it just like through those jabs and shit, he could just run right through those, slip those, ping those off of the arm. But overall, he could hurt Zurdo. He could ping the punches off of his arm, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And, and he could ping the punches off of his arm, and shit like that, counter Zurdo with some really nice punches. He could easily dictate this fight with himself and shit like that, you know what I mean? Avoid punches and shit like that, you know what I mean? And shit like that, and catch Zurdo with some really good flurries. It could be one punch that could hurt Zurdo and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But overall and shit like that, what I would like to see Benavidez do is that I would like to see Benavidez kind of fight more sharpshootively. I know he has his own style where he keeps his hands up and he kind of has it where he has them both aligned together and shit. But I feel like he can distance himself so well that I want to see him kind of have more of a sharpshooter type of stance. Where how can you do fighting off of that back foot? How can you be able to time those punches and stretch your southpawness to where you can be able to pop that jab out, land that power hand, switch it up, land your shots and shit like that, like I've seen you do it a few times, but I kind of want to see where Benavidez can be able to kind of like lengthen himself out to keep it where his jab is out and then where his right hand is behind him and shit like that, you know what I mean, and stuff, and have being like more of a sharpshooting stance. Because if he's in more of a sharpshooting stance you know, and shit like that. And especially, like, obviously with Benavidez with his punching, I know Benavidez would have really good success. If he has success with that right there, I don't think Zurdo would have a singular fucking chance in this fight. Because then he could close his guard up, pivot, get into the inside. But Benavidez, like, he could, like, you know, go from a sharp shooting style against Zurdo to then closing the guard up, and then after that being in kind of like a shelled up stance, and then be able to counter the shit out of Zurdo and catch him with flurries, and basically just do that the whole time and just flurry him out, you know, throw the bunch of combinations that you throw, you know, the 20 fucking 30 combinations that you could throw, or like the 10 to 15 punch combinations that you could throw and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. And realistically, because overall Benavidez and shit like that is the aggressor in this fight. He's gonna fight how he does, you know, a guard where you know is gonna be low, a high guard, or and shit like that, you know. And he's just gonna land his punches and shit like that, you know. And he's gonna, and overall, you know, and stuff like that, like how he always does, you know, and shit like that. He's gonna land it. He's gonna, you know, quickly land his punches. He's not gonna waste no time. Zurdo isn't gonna be really a defensive fighter like that. So I feel like landing his punches on Zurdo, it's really gonna be effective regardless if it's on the arms, if it's on the body, the chest, the face, you know, and shit like that. I feel like everything is kind of just a target for Benavidez and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. So it's just, he just has to put the work in. Maybe just put like switch up the game plan to make him look like more better and shit like that, you know, to show that he has different ways of how he can fight and shit, you know, to fight more in kind of like a you know, not like a Philly shell, but like a Philly type of stance, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean, and stuff like that, you know, and know how to fight out the back foot, you know how to even use that stance to you know, even destroy Zurdo in the inside, because you could take punches too. But with that kind of stance, you could just go and just keep on rocking Zurdo with those punches, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall, just like in any fight, I want to see where Benavidez, he's not going to keep his head center and shit like that, you know what I mean, against Zurdo, you know, and shit like that, you know, and he's not gonna keep his head center against Zurdo and shit like that, you know, because keeping your head center against Zurdo, I feel like that's something where Zurdo might be already noticing in this fight, where Benavidez does constantly keep his head center and shit like that, you know, but he does slip his head off the center line, but not always. He kind of does it whenever he wants to and shit like that, and he'll go and take punches, but sometimes with any fighter and shit like that, you know, and when you're just taking open punches like that, you don't always know what fighter you're gonna get hit by, and what type of power they're throwing and what they're on and shit like that, you know what I mean, and shit like that, you know what I mean. So it's just at the same time, that's where he got to be able to count. That's where, you know, Zurdo can just go and hit him down the pipe with the right hand and shit like that, you know, and just continuously hit him and find some type of punch that can send Benavidez on the canvas and shit like that, you know, or just constantly beat Benavidez to the punch constantly and throwing his flurries and, you know, basically just beating Benavidez to the punch every single time with everything, because overall and shit, he's just keeping, because he kind of just walked forward on punches and will take punches and shit like that, you know, and you can, and especially if it's a really nice punch, man, you never know what he can do with that punch. So I wanted to see Benavidez where, you know, where it's like, you know, like, not, you don't always have to just keep your head on a swivel, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean. But I'm just saying, like, overall at the same time, like, it just, you know, you need to, like, not take so many open shots. Like, it just, if you, like, you know, like at the same time, keep your head on the swivel, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean. But it just counter the punch, look more precise. Don't just always take so many open punches and then look like, you know, you're kind of, you know, being vulnerable and you're not knowing what to do and shit like that. Because then if it's like that, Zurdo might actually really confuse you and could actually switch up the game plan on you where you might not actually know what to do and shit like that, because he's a heavy puncher, a heavy dude himself with some long arms and shit like that, a big physique and shit like that, you know what I mean? So overall and shit like that, it's not going to be very easy and shit like that to wanting to just switch up the game plan, because Zurdo's already switching up the game plan too. How many times he's switching up the game plan, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So don't keep your head center, Benavidez. Make sure that you're keeping your head on this in the swivel, and shit like that, not always just just doing the unordinary and just moving your head too much, but it just, and not throwing punches. But we already know at the same time, even if you keep your head on the swivel, we already know that you're gonna keep your head moving and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, but it just look more sharp with it, slip the punch, counter, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And because I feel like this fight might be not so beneficial for Benavidez when he by him keeping his head center against a guy like Zurdo, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. So keep your head on the swivel, avoid those punches, slip those punches, like with the uppercuts, move away from the punch and shit like that, you know what I mean? Smack, Zurdo with the punch and shit like that, you know what I mean? Catch it and hurt him and just really just like how you always do, beat the shit out of fighters and just smother them on the ropes, and shit like that. Beat the body in, and shit like that, counter from far distance, and shit like that, just basically be the distance manager, and just do whatever you want to do in this fight, and shit like that, but don't be always so clumsy and keeping your head in the center line against Zurdo Ramirez. But yeah. But on to who I think is going to win this fight between David Benavidez versus Zurdo Ramirez. And yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Um, and overall and shit like that, I think this is gonna be a good fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Both fighters are gonna bring it to each other, definitely for sure in this fight, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But I just, overall and shit like that, round for round, I feel like the early rounds and stuff like that, honestly, I feel like the early rounds is definitely going to go in favor of Zurdo. Zurdo is definitely a lot quicker of a starter than Benavidez, and shit like that, so the early rounds is going to be Zurdo. I'm going to say it's going to be I'm going to say it's going to be 4-0 in favor of Zurdo, or I'm gonna say I'm gonna say Benavidez is gonna win one round, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But Zurdo is gonna be basically the dictator throughout the whole time. The mid rounds and shit like that, it's pretty competitive, but I do see where Benavidez does win the mid rounds, 3-1 Benavidez, and then the later rounds and stuff like that, you know what I mean? That's where I do see where Benavidez, just takes it from there, just combobbles, Zurdo with punches, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But at the same time, Zurdo is still throwing his punches and he still is also, in the fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, and is switching up the game plan. So at the same time, I do see Zurdo winning rounds too in that round, in the later rounds. But I do see where Benavidez is gonna have a strong finish, and shit like that in the fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, and overall and shit like that, honestly, do I see Benavidez stopping Zurdo in the later rounds? Honestly, to be honest with you, I feel like Zurdo does get hit enough. And I feel like if he does get hit by Benavidez like that numerous of times, and shit like that, you know what I mean? I do think that it would end up in a stoppage. So overall, in that kind of standpoint, I am going to predict that David Benavidez is going to stop Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez in, I would say, round 10. solidly, I am going to say that Benavidez is going to stop Zurdo in round 10. I feel like the first time that Benavidez hurt Zurdo, Zurdo is going to be just rattled all over the place, getting hit by every single shot that Benavidez is throwing at him. He's showing heart, a chin, but it's not gonna be enough, and he gets sent right down to the canvas, and shit like that. Right when he gets set down to the canvas, Benavidez is on his ass and shit like that, no diddy and shit like that. You know what I mean? And he's basically just putting the hammer on Zurdo, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And puts again the same amount of beatdown, drops him again, but then after that, when he gets up again, Benavidez fucking rocks his skull to the, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And rattles him even worse than it was before. And then now and shit like that, he's throwing a bunch of punches at Zurdo. Zurdo is on the ropes and shit like that, you know what I mean? And shit, the ref is really thinking about wanting to stop it. Zurdo gets smacked again and shit like that by a hard punch, and he gets sent right to the canvas. He is dozed out. He doesn't know what the fuck is going on, and the ref stops the fight. And that's where I have it, where I have David Benavidez stopping Zurdo Ramirez in the 10th round out of 12 rounds in the fight. Overall, I do see the fight where it is going to be competitive, and shit like that. I do see where Benavidez is going to be the dictator, but the one time that Benavidez does turn up the gas tank and does, land his power shots on Zurdo, that's where Zurdo is going to get really hurt and shit, and that's where it's just going to be over and shit like that, you know what I mean? Zurdo doesn't really, especially when the monster is angry in there, and shit like that, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not like you can necessarily just go and, it's not like you can just go and necessarily just, especially if you're Zurdo, it's not like you can just go and avoid the punches like your Mayweather or some shit, and stuff like that. Not even Canelo could be able to avoid those kind of punches, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So in that kind of case of scenario, that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, and shit like that, But overall, that's the thing and shit like that, So overall, I don't think Zurdo is going to be able to avoid those punches very well. I don't think he's going to be able to escape those punches very well. So towards the end, once those big flurries are about to come in and shit like that, you know what I mean? That's when Benavidez and stuff like that is gonna really hurt Zurdo, and he's gonna stop Zurdo. So overall, that's my final prediction, y'all. Is that I got Gilberto? That's my final prediction, y'all. My final prediction for this fight is that I got David Benavidez winning this fight by a stoppage in the later rounds. I do see this fight where it is. Sorry about that, yo. My phone kept turning off and shit. But overall and shit like that. But yeah, man, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But overall, that's, the thing and shit like that, So overall, that's my final prediction for this main event for this weekend. Is that overall, I got David Benavidez stopping Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez in the 10th round in a good fight, in a war, and shit like that. Because we're all human. Zurdo is human. Zurdo is a good fighter. Benavidez is human. Benavidez is a good fighter, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, It's not going to just be an easy task for Benavidez to just get through Zurdo. But it's just at the same time, once he does and shit like that, in my prediction, I do think that's where he is going to get Zurdo out of there. I just think overall Benavidez, and shit like that, like even though they both have tough grit, but I just feel like Benavidez is the quicker puncher. He mixes up his combinations better, and shit like that, you know what I mean? I still think at the same time, if it's anything and shit, because I've seen, even though I never really seen where Zurdo's been hurt like that, but either way, Zurdo does run into punches, and at the same time, if Zurdo does run into punches of Benavidez, nobody's gonna really be able to handle those punches all that very well. But at the same time, you never know. He probably could handle to go the distance and shit like that. You never know. He could most definitely win this fight by constantly switching the game plan up and having a really good motivation in this fight and shit like that. You know what I mean? But it just overall, in my prediction, I just feel like the Monster has his nickname for a reason. And I just feel like overall, it just, I feel like, he's like, it just, you know, it just, I just feel like overall Benavidez has just constantly shown that really nobody is on his level like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, Zurdo can prove something different. But I'm just saying Benavidez has constantly showed that he is just something different. He is just somebody that is just, it's not something easy that you could just go and just calculatedly beat, that easily and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So, overall, my final prediction for this video and for this main event, and stuff like that, is that overall I got David Benavidez stopping Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez in the 10th round by a TKO. Thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out. Peace.